Hmm. Hello, my name is Patty Duijm, and I'm currently head of department for the securities, payments, and sustainability statistics at the Nederlandse Bank, the Dutch central bank. And as you may understand, this is the department that is also responsible for the development and production of climate change related indicators. In that respect, I'm currently also co-chairing the European Central Bank Expert Group that is responsible for the development of the climate change related indicators at the European level. So my team works closely together with colleagues from the European central banks and the other central banks. And the focus of this lecture is on how we collect climate-related data, how we deal with data and methodological challenges, and how new indicators are being developed to support financial analysis and policy. Well, this work is part of the broader effort of central banks to better understand climate-related risks and their relevance for the financial system, monetary policy, and financial stability. AMOS module is jointly organized by the European System of Central Banks, the European Statistical System, and AMOS labeled programs. And that combination is important and beneficial because climate change related statistics clearly sit at the intersection of official statistics and central banking. So they require close cooperation between statisticians, economists, supervisors, and data scientists across Europe. And therefore, we are very glad with the existing cooperations. Well, necessary to say here, these views I present here are based on joint work and do not necessarily reflect the official position of individual institutions or myself. To the topic. So climate change is no longer a distant risk. It's already shaping the economic and financial environment in which we operate. And as Caroline Willeke mentioned in the fifth lecture, the climate change related indicators help us to get a better understanding of the transition towards a green economy with its challenges and opportunities, of course. But also, the indicators are necessary to effectively analyze climate risk that could affect monetary policy and the financial system. But in order to really grab those risks and to identify, assess, and manage them, we really need the data. And that's exactly the challenge. So climate change is not only challenging the society, but to really understand what the impact of climate change is, it starts with challenges to the data. Well, since 2022, the ESCB has been working systematically on the development of climate-related statistical indicators. And as mentioned, this work supports climate-related financial analysis and policy, and it's also embedded in the ECB's broader climate action plan. And luckily, the work is carried out by a large expert group with more than 50 participants and many observers from central banks and other institutions. And currently, we have defined 3 types of indicators. And together, these indicators help assess how exposed financial institutions are to climate-related risks. So, for example, transition risks and physical risks based on their securities and loan portfolios. So the first group are the sustainable finance indicators. These are green and sustainable bonds. And these features are developed by the colleagues responsible for the securities statistics because it really are securities, statistics on securities, bonds, and investments. And these are published since 2022. Well, when it comes to the green bonds, we really look at the extent to which banks, insurance companies, pension funds, and other financial institutions have invested in bonds aimed at promoting sustainability. The second group of indicators are the carbon emissions indicators. So that is actually the carbon footprint of the financial sector's investments, which can be used to gauge the degree of exposure of the sector to transition risks, for example. So the transition towards a greener economy may pose risks to financial institutions because they may have invested in investments that will devaluate because of the transition. And lastly, we have some indicators for physical risks. So those indicators measures to which extent financial institutions are exposed through their loans and investments to flooding and hail damage, for example. And the carbon emissions indicators and the physical risk indicators will be explained in much more detail in the subsequent lectures. It's for now good to know that these indicators are classified as analytical indicators. So we developed these new data sets, these new indicators in a very short time periods. And it's good to know that, yes, yet they are not perfect. And I will soon explain what the shortcomings are. But since these figures are so urgently needed, because, as I mentioned, we really need the data to know what is actually happening in the financial industry when it comes to climate change. So because we really need the data, we have decided to already make the statistics available as soon as possible to anyone who wishes to use the data. But it is, however, essential for the users of the data to know what the shortcomings are and that there are clear shortcomings when using these data. So in the next slide, I will tell you a bit more about the source data and methodological challenges we face while producing these statistics. So, first of all, we encounter some challenges that stem from our source data when producing these statistics. In contrast to other statistics that central banks publish, we don't get the source data from financial institutions that report to us. So for the regular and official statistics, financial institutions report their data to the central bank, and that is the source data for making statistics. Well, in the case of climate-related indicators, we have to rely on public sources and existing data and combine them to create the climate change-related indicators. And thereby, we have to integrate and work with new types of data. So, for example, geospatial information or climate scenarios, which are of course essential for assessing the climate risks like floods or heat stress. But working with this kind of data is quite a new thing for us. And at the same time, we need to link those data at very different levels and from very different sources. So, for example, we have information on carbon emissions from companies, and we have to link them to the holdings and investments of financial institutions to create the carbon emission indicators. But often, unique identifiers or clear definitions are still missing, making this quite a complex task. And also, the data is at different levels. So the information on bank loans is at a more granular level compared to the information that we have on, for example, flood risks. But instead, wherever possible, we rely on the ESCB internal datasets and publicly available sources. But in practice, we need to often complement them with data from commercial data providers. Talked about the source data challenges, there are also some methodological challenges that we face. Given limitations in, for example, combining multiple data sources, we have published figures that in some cases currently only cover half of the investment portfolios. This means that in cases, the figures can be interpreted as a lower limit of the actual transition and financial risks. An example is small and medium businesses. So financial institutions also invest in small and medium businesses. But those businesses are often not reporting all the information, so for example on carbon emissions, that we need to produce our statistics. A second point is that data sources are sometimes inconsistent. So for some data, multiple data sources exist. However, in cases they are not at all comparable. Thirdly, while, as mentioned, we mostly rely on public sources and existing internal datasets, we sometimes must use commercial data. But often it is unclear how these data are produced, and if we use them, there are restrictions for sharing these data, which makes it challenging to effectively use the data. Another key concern is the limited assurance on carbon and ESG data by companies. So a perfect example here is the green bonds. So the appellation green bonds is currently applied by the company issuing the bond themselves in many cases. And regarding the data, we are of course interested in the development of the indicators over time. So is the exposure to climate-related risks decreasing? How is the carbon intensity of financial portfolios developing? These questions you would like to answer. However, the indicators are partly based on financial and accounting data. This means that inflation and exchange rate effects play a role. So for example, is the fact that the carbon footprint of an institution is decreasing caused by an actual greening of the portfolio of the financial institution? Or are there some other elements, such as price effects, that have an impact? Well, we have previously shown that price effects can explain up to a third of the change in the carbon footprint over time. So that's quite a lot. Therefore, it is essential to know what is driving the indicators. And we are currently further improving the so-called decomposition of indicators, where we show which elements are contributing to changes in the indicators over time. And lastly, for the indicators for physical risks, we have by no means been able to include all the locations of companies in which the financial sector invests. The data is just simply missing. Yes, so I hope to have showed you that there are still some, data source and methodological challenges that we face when producing these statistics. But let me conclude with a brief look ahead. So the development of the ECB climate indicators is very much a process of continuous improvement. We aim for better coverage, more frequent updates, and more timely data through ongoing methodological enhancements. And the statistics are published on a yearly basis. So that means that each year you can find the updated statistical indicators. And each year we aim to increase the quality of the data and to, as I mentioned, enhance the indicators. Well, for now, I hope to have give you a bit of an understanding of the indicators and the challenges that we face. And in the subsequent lectures, you will get much more in-depth information on, how the indicators actually look like, what's happening in the financial sector. So this was my part. And for now, I wish you a lot of fun in the subsequent lectures in this very interesting field.